Thanks very much, Louise, and thanks very much for coming this morning, everyone. My jet lag's just started to kick in this morning, so I'm reminded of a story that my friend Martin Burley, Martin, put your hand up, told me about one time when he travelled to Townsville in Australia. He just got off the plane and went straight to give his plenary talk in a similar situation to this, was overcome with tiredness and almost fell asleep at the podium. So, if I fall asleep, please be understanding and just throw a blanket over me or something like that. So I started working on HIA 10 years ago, and this work grew out of a government policy to address health inequity issues within New South Wales, which is a state within Australia centred on Sydney that has a population of around 9 million people. And what came out of that was we were trialling and developing the voluntary use of HIA to look at government proposals. And as we were starting out, we got a lot of criticism from the people who were working in environmental health at that time, because they said, look, we're already doing HIAs, we're doing this stuff on major projects, we don't know what you're doing, but it's not HIA. And that sort of conflict and so on was really quite difficult to resolve in the early years. But as time went on, we saw that not only were they struggling to get health considered in the assessment of major projects, it was often having less of an impact on decision making than some of the voluntary HIA processes that we were trialling. So we started to get involved in major project assessment ourselves, and it became clear that the goals of these assessments were superficially similar to voluntary HIAs of policy, namely protect health, promote health and reduce health inequalities. But there was a different emphasis. The focus tended to be more on health protection than some of the other goals of HIA, which is appropriate given the nature of the proposals they were looking at. So this different emphasis was, but it suggested that the HIAs were being done for quite different purposes. And at that same time as we had that experience about trying to reconcile this voluntary versus, mandated project HIA, we had exposure and we learnt a lot from our colleagues in the Asia-Pacific region, particularly from Thailand. And you'll recognise Detrat and Sompom Pengham in this photo as well, who are at this conference. And what was happening in Thailand highlighted for us that whilst it's tempting to view HIA as this dichotomy between assessment of projects and assessment of policies, there was a whole range of activities that were undertaken by those outside the decision-making processes, which followed an HIA process but were quite different in some aspects. So this led us to develop a typology of HIA, which identifies 4 different forms, based really on their purpose rather than the nature of the proposal being assessed. The first of these is mandated HIA, which is undertaken when there's a requirement to do it, essentially. So this is often associated with major projects, but increasingly we're actually seeing requirements for people to conduct HIAs on things like service plans, strategic plans, and other types of proposals as well. And these photos are from the Basslink HIA, which was a large impact assessment of an electricity and energy project that linked Tasmania, the island at the bottom of Australia, to the mainland's national electricity grid, and a health impact assessment was conducted as part of that, a small part of a number of assessment processes. So that's a good example of a mandated HIA. The next type is decision support HIA. So these are essentially undertaken voluntarily because someone thinks it's a good idea. And so it's done with the goal of improving the proposal, not necessarily because there's a requirement. And that this diagram's from a decision support HIA that was conducted by 12 government agencies on a 25-year population and land use plan for the Hunter region, which is an area around 2 hours north of Sydney. Nobody was forcing them to do it. These agencies came together to actually look at the health impacts themselves. So this is a good example, I think, of a decision support HIA, and has been written up a bit in the literature if you're interested. Advocacy HIAs are a bit different because they're conducted by people outside the decision-making process, so they're neither the proponent nor the consent authority. These HIAs tend to be more overtly political, and their goal is to use public opinion to bring around change. So this photo is from the Northern Territory, which is the part of Australia above South Australia where Danny works. The Australian Indigenous Doctors Association we worked with to undertake an advocacy HIA on a fairly broad cross-sectoral government intervention in the Northern Territory that removed rights from Aboriginal communities under the justification of addressing child abuse. So this was a far-reaching, quite frankly retrograde policy. So the Indigenous Doctors Association didn't necessarily hold out much hope of influencing the policy, but they felt that the impacts were severe enough that they warranted examination and documentation in some form. And subsequently it has had some impact on the evaluation and the extension of this policy, but it's, as you can imagine, this is much more overtly political than a lot of HIAs that we deal with. Community-led HIAs are often similar to advocacy HIAs because they tend to be done because communities are concerned about significant health impacts and that have been overlooked or sidelined in other decision-making processes. So I took this photo around 2 weeks ago in rural New South Wales with a group who are doing their own HIA. They've raised funds for it with local community and local industry as well to look at the impacts of massive expansions of coal mining and coal seam gas in the area around Gunnedah in New South Wales. So they're concerned about cumulative impacts and as a result of mining and coal seam gas. And they want to influence strategic government decision making about, land use for that whole region, which is, the issue of mining abutting agricultural land and how to reconcile some of those issues. And so it's moving beyond the project level, but trying to look at influencing the decision at a more strategic level. So whilst the different forms of HIA share many characteristics, they're usually done for quite different purposes. In the real world, the delineations I've found between these different forms is often imprecise. So some community-led HIAs attempt to feed into mandated assessment processes at times. Some decision support HIAs can end up looking more like advocacy HIAs at the end of the process, particularly when they're conducted intersectorally. So in my view, the typology is not necessarily perfect, but it can be useful because it allows us not necessarily to categorise HIAs, but it helps to explain and understand some of the diversity that we can see in practice. Some colleagues and I recently completed a study on the effectiveness of HIAs conducted in Australia and New Zealand between 2005 and 2009. Andy Dannenberg, Detroit Suknoed and Arthur Wendell were involved in that project, and they're here at the conference. And so we managed to identify 115 HIAs within that study period, but only 55 met the criteria, and that's for reasons such as they needed to have publicly available reports, they needed to have recommendations, they needed to follow a recognisable impact assessment process. And so what's interesting is if we look at in terms of the breakdown from the typology, there were 35 done in Australia, and the majority, 28, were decision support, 4 were mandated, 2 were advocacy and 1 was community-led. 24 were conducted in New Zealand over that period, and 24 were all decision support HIAs. What's interesting is that since 2009, the proportion of advocacy and community-led HIAs has increased dramatically, which has also coincided with a marked and dramatic reduction in funding and support for decision support HIAs and mandated HIAs and capacity building programs associated with those forms of HIA. So what's interesting is that the diversity of practice has enabled HIA to survive, but more importantly for the health issues to still be considered in public decision making. So this to me suggests that in addition to the 3 goals that I mentioned before, there might be 2 other ones. The fourth is that HIA is also about improving governance and public decision making, and it's a small part of a much larger movement towards this goal. But what's important is that this goal is often resonates more with other sectors as much as the issue of health itself does. The 5th goal, I think, is learning, and that's a common theme across all types of HIA. Every HIA we do is done to learn something, but the nature of that learning that's desired isn't always the same. So the learning can take place at different levels, and that ranges from the personal through to the organisational, right through to the social level, but also it can take different forms. Technical learning involves searching for technical solutions to fixed policy objectives. So that's really about tweaking, making minor changes and enhancements to the proposal. Conceptual learning involves redefining goals, redefining problems and strategies. So it's thinking about how we could achieve some of the same objectives through different means. That social learning emphasises dialogue and increased social interaction between stakeholders, and this is distinct from the concept of social learning that's referred to in the psychology literature. So what I think is important is that from an evaluation perspective, we can see it's difficult to consider the effectiveness of HIA without looking at both the purpose of the HIA and the type of learning, the nature of the learning that's sought, and that both are closely linked to expectations of stakeholders involved in the HIA. So the takeaway messages I'd like you to take from this session are that the typology, that there's more than one form of HIA and they have different purposes. Learning from HIAs takes different forms, so as I mentioned, the technical, the conceptual and the social. And that it's important to examine both purpose and types of learning that are desired when evaluating HIAs, because when we're talking about the effectiveness of HIA, we can think of it in crude sort of instrumental, this is how many recommendations we can tick off as having been implemented. But when we think about those broader impacts, we really need to look at this issue of what the purpose of the HIA is and what the desired learning is. So, HIA is fit for more than one purpose. I think we shouldn't focus on codification or standardisation of practice necessarily, because it might actually reduce our ability to respond effectively to emerging health issues. If we think about my experience in Australia and New Zealand, when we lose support for decision support HIA or capacity building programs for HIA, it's actually having that diversity of practice that still enables health issues to get looked at in this public decision making process. So I think the current diversity of practice can sometimes be a bit anxiety provoking, but it's also a useful thing, it's a good thing. So I'd like to thank the conference organisers, my colleagues at the University of New South Wales and the health section members of the International Association for Impact Assessment who've helped me enormously. And I'd also just like to flag that the IAIA conference will be in Calgary next year, so it's a great opportunity for many of you to come along, because a great challenge for us is we often talk about intersectorality. IAIA is a great venue to actually walk the talk. You know, we get to connect to so many other forms of impact assessment and decision making. And I'd like to also invite all the IAIA section members who are here, meet at the table following this session so we can get a photo of the group of us together. That'd be great. So these slides are available and those are the ways you can contact me. Thanks very much for your attention.